I'm just getting it into presenter mode there for you now.
So thank you, Ross, for that wonderful talk, full of heart. And now I get the fun job of the boring science talk immediately afterwards. So my name is Robert McCarthy. Thank you all for coming this evening. I'm a pediatric registrar currently working out at the Coombe Hospital, but I also work with the Trinity Research Group and the DISCO team out in Tala, looking into research for children with Down syndrome in Ireland. And the talk I'm going to give you today is looking at new areas of immune research, specifically in Down syndrome, and I'm also going to touch on some of the research that's been done in the past. So I thought I'd start by giving just a quick recap on kind of how the immune system works. And I'll be honest, this was very much for my benefit as well, because having worked in clinical for many years, you forget some of the science behind all this. So it was good just to go back over it again. So what is your immune system? We all hear that term throughout our whole lives. Your immune system does this, it protects you from infection. But I suppose a lot of the time we don't really think about how it actually works. What's the nitty gritty behind it all? And basically, it's your bodyguard. It protects you from all these harmful agents that want to come in and cause damage, whether it's bacteria, viruses, all sorts. Its job is to kick into action when any of these things come into your system, remove them quickly and efficiently, causing as little damage to the host, you, as possible, and kind of letting you get on with things. But it is a complicated system. It's composed of lots of different things that we can see with the naked eye and some that we can't see, that we have to kind of look at under the microscope or in a lab. But the big parts, I suppose, that we probably are, some of us are familiar with, would be things like the bone marrow, which is where your cells originally kind of are developed and grow. You also have your lymph nodes in your neck, under your armpits, different parts of the body. These are full of immune cells as well. And as you know, they swell up, they get sore when you have an infection, and that's kind of your immune system kicking into action, causing inflammation and ultimately clearing the infection. You have immune cells in your tonsils and your adenoids as well. You know, whenever you get a sore throat, they get very sore and swollen. That's because they're full of immune cells. And you have something else called the thymus, which kind of sits in your chest. That one's a little more interesting. It's quite prominent in children when they're born. They have this large thymus gland. Its job is kind of to develop particular immune cells using the kind of a memory of your immune system, which I'll talk about a little bit more about later. But it is one of those glands which plays a key role kind of in your immune development. And in children with Down syndrome, there's been studies out there to show that the thymus gland is sometimes a little underdeveloped, a little smaller than it should be. And also sometimes part of it can be removed. A lot of these children have cardiac issues, as you know, and in the process of having to repair hearts, sometimes some thymus gland gets removed as well. Again, there's a lot of research going on at the moment as to what kind of effect this has in the long term, but it's just something worth mentioning. And then in terms of the immune system, the parts you can't really see, the parts that you kind of have to study from the lab side of things, it's broken into two systems. You have your innate immune system and your adaptive immune system. Your innate immune system is kind of your body's first line defense. When a bug comes into the system, there's various cells involved that attack and remove it as quickly as possible so you can carry on with things. And your adaptive immune system is slightly more specialized. This is the part of your immune system that remembers infection. If you had an infection once, it gets marked, and the next time that same bug comes into your system, your body's able to remove it very fast. And this is kind of the way vaccination works as well. You introduce small parts of a bacteria into the system, your body remembers it, and the next time that bug actually comes into the system, it's rapidly removed, doesn't cause any problems. And it's interesting, I suppose, in terms of children with Down syndrome, we know they sometimes have a poor response to vaccinations. They have low vaccine titers, they sometimes need their vaccine repeated. I suppose part of the theory behind that is that the adaptive immune system isn't working as well as it should do. Either it can't remember the infections as well as it should, or when it does do it, it doesn't do it efficiently. And so I won't spend too long harping on about this because it's getting a little bit sciencey, but in terms of the actual cells I talked about with the innate and the immune system, if you look at the innate immune system, it's broken down into lots of different cells. Some of these you've probably heard of, things like neutrophils, natural killer cells, macrophages, and their job, they all have a unique, distinct role, but their basic job is to remove infection as quickly as possible by various mechanisms. On the right-hand side is the adaptive immune system, and this is your kind of memory system for your body. And its job, like I said, is kind of mark these different infections when they come in so they can be rapidly removed the next time. Breaking it down a little bit further, you have other components of the immune system itself. So again, antibodies, which a lot of us may have heard of in the past. These are these little proteins produced by your adaptive immune system, your memory immune system. And their basic job is to kind of mark bacteria when they come into the system and copy the code, so to speak. So the next time that particular bug comes in, these antibodies, which have been created the first time around, can rapidly go and attach to the bacteria, as you can see in the image here, and then that bacteria can be quickly removed from the system. So obviously we need these to function properly. If you have too much or too little of them, that can cause problems, or if they're not working properly, that can cause problems as well. Another component are things called cytokines. These are tiny little proteins that all these different immune cells I had in the last slide produce. And their job basically is to act as those signal messengers between the different cells. So when an infection comes in and say your lymphocyte there detects the infection, it wants to recruit more of itself. It'll fire out lots of these little cytokines, say, right, we need to get more cells into the system here. Let's remove this infection. Let's ramp up the inflammation and carry on. Likewise, you also need cytokines that downgrade inflammation because you don't want the inflammation to keep going. You don't want this kind of constant pro-inflammatory cascade. So in addition to having pro-inflammatory cytokines, you'll have the opposite. You'll have anti-inflammatory cytokines, and their job is basically to switch everything off. So when the infection is cleared or when it's clearing, the immune system calms itself down. And obviously we want those two systems to function, in nice, in good order, because obviously we don't want too much inflammation. And likewise, we want to be able to switch off the inflammation once it's kind of done its job. The other two little components I'll just mention are these things called toll-like receptors. These are basically little proteins that live on the surface of all those different cells I talked about. And they're kind of like the name implies, it's the toll system. They're the guards that sit on the surface and keep an eye out for any bacteria or other pathogens floating around out there. So they can detect them early and kind of tell the cell inside, right, let's switch on the cytokines, let's switch on the antibodies, let's get all the machinery up and running. So they play an important role too, as that kind of first line of detecting these different agents when they come in. And like everything else, if there's too much or too little or they're not functioning properly, that's going to lead to problems with our immune system as well. And the last part I'll mention is something called the inflammasome. And this is a big scary looking wheel on the right here. And basically it's a collection of proteins that live inside the cells. And its job is to promote inflammation, to kind of drive that inflammatory process when it's appropriate. Problems arise sometimes when this can't switch off and that inflammation continues on. And it's been linked to various complications in children with Down syndrome, particularly autoimmune complications where you have that constant inflammation in the background that's hard to switch off and can go unnoticed for quite a while before sometimes it's picked up and appropriately treated. So that's a big preamble into the immune system. Lots of stuff there. I've tried to sum up as quickly as possible. And when this all works well, it's great. Bugs come in, your body kicks into action, it removes them, you carry on with your life. But I suppose the question then arises, what happens when this goes wrong? What happens when, say, your body looks at different parts of itself and it thinks, that looks like it might be an infection, I better clear it, but actually it's just a normal part of the body. Well, that's called autoimmunity. It's when your body sees parts of its own system, thinks it's a foreign agent like a bacteria, switches on the immune system and goes into attack mode. The problem there is you get like this wonderful cartoon shows, you get this problem where the organs of the body, which, really should be left alone, get this inflammatory process, which can wear them down over time. It can attack things like the kidneys, the thyroid gland, the heart, the joints, whatever. There's lots of areas of the body that this can occur in. And we know in children with Down syndrome, they have particular autoimmune complications that affect several organs. So the thyroid being one of them, we know they suffer from underactive thyroids, but it can also go the opposite. It can be overactive, and this can be autoimmune related. Juvenile arthritis, this is something that's become a little bit more, we've had a little bit more knowledge about this in the last 15 to 20 years. And we know this affects larger numbers of children with Down syndrome than it does the general population. I suppose in that one in particular, it's a little bit tricky because a lot of the times it can go underdiagnosed for quite a while. It gets written off as, these children aren't walking as quickly as children with Down syndrome. Well, that's part of Down syndrome, but a lot of time it's not. It's actually because they're in quite a lot of pain. And if it's not being recognized early and, picked up on, that's a problem. So we're getting better awareness and knowledge of that one, which is brilliant because we like to get in early. It's very treatable if we can if we can be proactive. And then there are other conditions which we've all heard of, things like diabetes and celiac disease. These are more prevalent in children with Down syndrome as well. And they're all in that autoimmune kind of family where the body's kind of attacking its own systems. So part of the reason we're doing all this research, I suppose, is to understand what parts of the immune system are functioning inappropriately to cause these different things. And I suppose, can we do anything about them? In addition to autoimmunity, we know that these children also suffer from variations in infections in terms of their response. So we know that they have a tendency to get more severe infections than we would expect, and they have a tendency to have poorer outcomes as well, with more morbidity. These children also tend to get admitted to hospital more frequently, and they tend to have longer periods of stay as well when they are in hospital. And while there are some anatomical factors that contribute to this, things like shorter eustachian tubes in the ears causing more ear infections, larger tongues causing more throat infections. While this plays a role, the major contributing factor is the abnormalities in the immune system for these kids, whether it's the adaptive immune system and their memory system, or whether it's the innate immune system, and whether that's not functioning properly. And like I said, all these different parts of the immune system, cytokines, inflammasome activity, toll-like receptors, they can all play a role. And given the enormous complexity of the system, if one thing goes out of sync, it can cause a cascade of events that end up with kind of that clinical presentation of an unwell child. So it's a huge area of research that we're trying to tackle, and lots of it has been done before me. But I'm just going to quickly talk to you about the project we're doing at the moment, which is called Dragonfly, which stands for Down syndrome and multi-organ follow-up and inflammatory markers. And all the letters Dragonfly are in there, but I've been very liberal in making that happen. But I assure you, all those letters are in there. So you can see my name down there, but it's very much a collaborative effort. So Professor Malloy is the primary supervisor, but my co-supervisor for this project are also Dr. Joanne Balfe and Dr. Judith Meehan. And we have various contributors, and I've probably forgotten a few on this list, but just among them are Dr. Joanna Azeza Korea, Dr. Lynn Kelly, Ms. Beth Cork, and Ms. Fiona McGrain, and Professors Orla Franklin and Basil Al-Nazir. So you can see it's a long list of people, and we're only just getting started. So this list will probably grow over time. And that entire preamble I did in the immune system just now is probably just to tee up this slide, which is quite wordy, but bear with me. So this was a study done by a previous researcher, Dr. Dean Huggard, a few years ago with the group. And if you look to the left-hand side here of the screen, you can see the acquired immunity, it's also the adaptive or memory immunity. And what he found in his research was that these T and B cell numbers were actually lower in children with Down syndrome. So remember, these are your cells that remember infections before and kind of kick into action when these bugs come into the system. So in addition to not functioning properly, if you have lower numbers in the first place, well, that's going to limit your ability to actually fight infection. He also found that the immunoglobulins or the antibodies that these cells produce weren't functioning properly either. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. Other things he noted, if you look in the center and go to the top, is TLR2, those toll-like receptors, those little guards that sit on the surface of the cells. He found they were increased in certain cells like neutrophils and monocytes. And so while that sounds like, oh, a good thing, we're picking up these infections quicker, it's not always a good thing because it leads to actually inappropriate inflammation, too much activation of these cells. And that causes this clinical signs you see like redness, soreness, fatigue, tiredness, all that stuff that goes with inflammation is kind of an overdrive in these children. So it's an inappropriate response. So a lot of research has been done by my predecessors leading into this. These are just a few of the headings we put forward. We've looked at various things from toll receptor signaling abnormalities to overall systemic inflammation in these children. We've also looked at specific systems. So the one on the right there is talking about children with congenital heart diseases and comparing children with Down syndrome and congenital heart diseases to those with just congenital heart diseases who don't have Down syndrome, and whether or not there's differences in their inflammatory markers. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. We've also looked at some therapies that might actually, be beneficial. It's great to talk about all these immune system complications, but I suppose what we all want to know is, can we do anything about it? So this paper here was by, again, Dr. Huggard a few years back. They looked at melatonin. Some of you might have heard of it, helps with sleep, and lots of people take it. But they were looking at whether or not it could act as an immune modulator for these children to kind of dampen that inflammatory effect. And they did get some promising results out of that study as well to show that melatonin was beneficial. I won't take too long on this one. This is just a quick representation from a paper, again, by Dr. Huggard in 2019. And this was showing that the levels of TLR2, toll-like receptor 2 receptors were increased in children with Down syndrome. It's basically these two charts on the bottom here. The black lines represent children with Down syndrome, white lines represent children who don't have Down syndrome, and you can see the black lines are higher across the board. And this basically represents toll-like receptors on these different cells, and they're nearly double the height as they are in children with control. So there's definitely a correlation there with inflammation on these particular receptors in children. This is another, now this is, don't get too worried by this slide. It took me ages to figure it out myself. This is another study done by Dr. Zakharchenko back in 2022. And I basically just want you to look at this graph, these two pictures on the right-hand side here. These were children who had congenital heart disease. Some had Down syndrome, some did not. The dark line represents children without Down syndrome, while the dotted line represents children with Down syndrome. And 3 stages you can see are pre-surgery, during surgery, and after surgery. Those 3 kind of segments it breaks up into. In the dotted line, it's quite elevated in both those compared to the dark line at the bottom. And what those dotted lines represent is cytokines that drive inflammation. So in these children, they all have congenital heart disease. Some have Down syndrome, some don't. But in the Down syndrome group, they could see that these pro-inflammatory cytokines were elevated before they ever got surgery, despite having the same heart condition. So the heart condition alone wasn't the key factor here to say, oh, that's why your inflammation is overactive. You've got this congenital heart syndrome. Not really, because they looked at children who had the same thing without Down syndrome, and their levels weren't elevated. But interestingly, after the surgery, it looks like the levels actually come down to kind of correlate with the 2 groups. So that's a promising finding there, that it can kind of help inflammation if we can get some of those heart problems under control. Following on from that same study also looked at another marker in these children, which is something called EPO, erythropoietin. Some people might have heard of this in the audience. It's basically a precursor to your red blood cells. And what it does is it grabs onto oxygen in the blood with a much higher affinity than mature red blood cells. That's why sometimes you might have heard pro athletes have been caught being naughty and using it in sports when they shouldn't be. And that's one of the things it does. But in addition to that, it also is a marker for inflammation in these children. So if your EPO levels are high, it kind of indicates that your body isn't getting enough oxygen. And that's why you have higher EPO levels, because you need to kind of hold on to whatever oxygen you have. But in these children with Down syndrome, the EPO levels being high, we theorize that it represents that they're sometimes in this relatively low oxygen state, particularly when they're in sleep. As we know, children with Down syndrome have higher levels of obstructive sleep apnea and other sleep-related issues. And if it's going undiagnosed or unchecked for a long period of time, it might mean that they spend quite a lot of time with low oxygen levels. As a result, their erythropoietin levels are high. As a result, their inflammation levels are higher as well, because erythropoietin also drives inflammation. So this is just another aspect we're looking at in the study, and it's something we're going to follow on with in a little bit. So our hypothesis, after all that, is basically that altered inflammatory responses, increased susceptibility to infections, and dysregulated sleep in children with Down syndrome contributes to adverse clinical and developmental outcomes. And what that basically means is if we think that some of the immune markers that we can point to hopefully can lead us down the line of prognosticating what potential conditions they might develop. Like if you have a certain level of cytokines that looks like this, we might be able to say down the line you have a higher risk of developing thyroid issues, joint issues, or something like that. And why that's important, I suppose, is one, in terms of prognosticating for families and people affected by Down syndrome themselves, so they can kind of look towards the future, but also we can be proactive. We can refer appropriately. We might be able to treat appropriately. We might be able to kind of mitigate some of the symptoms. So that's kind of the long-term goals of why we do all this. I won't read all this because this is very, very wordy, but the 4 aims we have for the study, the first aim is fairly self-evident. We want to improve our understanding of the immune system in Down syndrome. Of course, that's why we want to do. That's the main reason we're doing this. But the other things are really important as well. So our second aim there on the right is what I just said. We want to develop that immunophenotype where we can look at immune cells in the lab, and then we can look to the patient and say, based on what we've seen in your blood, you may develop the following things over time. Let's put things in place to kind of mitigate this. Let's talk about treatments, what we can do. So it's kind of putting what you see in the lab into practice and making it beneficial. The third aim is we're actually going to look, like Dr. Hubbard did with the melatonin study, we're going to look at certain immunomodulator agents, and again, in the lab to see, can we dampen that down that inflammatory response, particularly looking at the inflammasome, that big scary wheel looking thing I mentioned earlier, to see, can we actually, show decreased inflammation by using different medications in the lab, and possibly, down the line, this might be something we can use in the real world. And lastly, we're going to continue to kind of advocate for research in children and young adults with Down syndrome. We're going to work with our partners in Down syndrome Ireland and in the UK as well, with possibly linking in with the DSMIG group and the James Lind Alliance. And we're going to be looking to possibly develop some new guidelines for these children before they leave hospital after they're born, to see what other things we can put in place to kind of help them in the long run. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. The nitty-gritty of the project, we're going to now, I've got a very optimistic number of 200 patients here. We'll see if I come anywhere close to that, but we'll be optimistic. But basically, in terms of the actual collecting of samples, I suppose it's really important to note that we will only be collecting samples in children who are attending our clinic, first of all, but the ones who are already booked in for a blood test, they're getting their thyroid function checked, they're getting their immune marker checked anyway. So in that point, we'll just, with fully informed consent, if the family and the young person themselves are happy, we'll just take an extra sample of blood. So it won't mean any extra scary needles or anything like that, because we don't want to obviously have this be a negative experience. But that's kind of the mechanics of how we're going to get it done. We're going to be meeting these children in clinic as well and kind of doing a full assessment and going through their whole history, finding out what complications they've had from a medical point of view, what investigations they've had done in the past, imaging, bloods, what their vaccine history is, what their infective history is, how many times have they been admitted to hospital, how many course of antibiotics think they've been prescribed over time. So we're going to try and gather as much information as possible so we can kind of compare it to what we get in the lab and hopefully start to put some things together. I won't harp on about this because I barely understand this part myself, but this is the lab methods. So we use these fancy different techniques, flow cytometry, PCR, and ELISA techniques. And this is just basically how we analyze the blood in the lab. One, we want to see, do we see the cells we're hoping to see? Those innate cells, those adaptive cells, how many of them are there? Are the appropriate numbers there? Are they not? And then we want to look at all these different cytokines. So all these letters here, IL-1 beta, 1 alpha, IL-2, IL-6, these are all different cytokines with their technical names. Some of them are pro-inflammatory, some of them are anti-inflammatory, but we're going to try and analyze which ones are elevated, which ones are down. So this is basically what we're going to do. My project is not called Starfish. I did steal this from a colleague of mine with full permission, but it is the same rough kind of diagram there. I just don't know how to make that. So the expected outcomes for this project, again, we want to improve our understanding of this systemic inflammatory response in these children, and hopefully, in the future, the potential for neuroadjuvant therapies. That would be the long-term goal. And again, immune markers hopefully assist us in kind of prognosticating these children going forward and maybe providing individualized plans for them kind of as they go through their childhood and adolescent years, what kind of things we can put in place to help them and their families. I'll quickly mention some additional areas of research. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be working with the James Lind Alliance, which some of you here may have worked with before. And they're basically a group in the UK that organise these meetings between medics and non-medics, science and non-science, but all of whom have a vested interest in the same topic, this one obviously being Down syndrome. And they work to bring us all together to kind of create a list of research priorities that all sides agree on, and then that can be published. So we'd be looking to kind of create a top 10 list of research goals that we can put out into the ether, and hopefully again we'll continue that push towards research from all sides. As I said earlier, we're also going to be looking to update our Down syndrome checklist for these children before they go home from hospital. The two areas we're going to be kind of looking into are, one, sleep disorders, like I mentioned earlier. So a lot of these children have delays, like everyone really, in getting kind of referred, getting seen in clinic and getting the investigations they need. But these particular ones are sleep studies that these children need, and the waiting list can be long. So one of the things we might be trying to advocate for with talking to Professor Basil El-Nazir, who's a respiratory consultant in Tala, is whether or not it would be worth advocating for these children to be referred on very early on in life, just so they can get these studies done early to prevent or possibly diagnose sleep apnea earlier than it is, to kind of decrease these erythropoietin levels potentially. And the other thing we're going to look at is kidney function in these kids. We know children with Down syndrome and young adults have a higher rate of kidney disease as the years go on. But at the moment, there's no national guidelines in terms of screening them when they're born to look with things like ultrasound to look at their kidneys to see is there any early malformations or problems with it. So that is one of the things we're going to be kind of going to discuss to see if we can add that to the list. Even if they have normal scans in this age, it's good to get a baseline normal scan. So if something does develop down the line, you can at least compare. So that's one of the things we're going to be arguing for. And then this thing is just something called cystatin C. Again, it's sticking in with that kidney disease background. We know cystatin C levels from our research so far are elevated in children with Down syndrome. Cystatin C is a protein that goes up when you're in when you have renal complications. Currently, it's not used widespread to check for renal dysfunction in any children really, and creatinine tends to be what we use in the lab. The problem with creatinine is it tends to be a bit it can give false results in children with and without Down syndrome, as well as different ethnicities, different sexes, and varying muscle mass. It tends to fluctuate quite a lot. And some of those are compounded even more in children with Down syndrome, particularly muscle mass. So we don't think it's as good a marker as cystatin C. So this is something we're going to look into with our research to see, can we propose maybe this as a marker for children's renal function. So after all that, what does this all mean for children with Down syndrome and their families in the long run, which is what you probably care about? So I suppose the big thing is to be able to kind of potentially identify children who are at risk of autoimmune diseases or significant infections early on, which again will allow us just to be a bit more proactive in our management. And like I said, maybe develop some patient-specific pathways. The potential to identify treatments for immune dysfunction in these children is something we would hope to gain more knowledge on going forward, as well as developing better clinical models for detecting specific complications, like I said, early renal disease or disorders of sleep. And like I said earlier, continue to advocate for ongoing research in these areas with children with Down syndrome for them and their families. So lastly, I'd like to say a very special thanks to a few people. Ms. Paula McCarthy, who was very kind and looked through all these slides meticulously for me before I presented today, which I'm very grateful for. Ms. Beck Corcoran for organising this whole event, which we can all agree is she's done a fantastic job. The whole Disco team who've been very supportive to me. And lastly, my wife, who listened to this lecture about 20 times in the last 2 days. So she gets a big thanks. She's on the recording there. Brilliant.